Hi, I'm Meredith Hutchison Hartley.
I'm Frank Hutchison.
And welcome back to the Hidden History of Business podcast. Today we're going to be talking about some misconceptions about women in business in the ancient world, particularly women in the ancient Roman Empire, which we know was a pretty hostile place to be a woman. There were very rigid legal restrictions on what women could do. They weren't allowed to vote. In fact, a freed woman couldn't make any decisions in business without the approval of a guardian. And this guardian was usually a father, a husband, or a man who was appointed by the court. And he had to approve every single transaction, the sale of property, anything, even if it belonged to the woman.
Well, that's because the Romans didn't consider women capable of doing business.
No,
they had to be protected. They
didn't. Around 100 AD, a jurist named Geddes stated that women could not act independently on account of the lightness of their mind. So they needed guardians. Basically, they were to the ancient world what Britney Spears and her father are today. She has a conservator, and he has to make all of her business decisions for her. She can't make any herself. Except Britney Spears had it a little bit better, because she can actually vote. Interesting thing about these women is that they found ways around the restrictive laws. We have evidence that they were managers, moneylenders, they rented property, and they ran their own international commerce companies. Even though the Romans really wanted them to be domestic creatures. I mean, what the Victorians wanted women to be, these gentle creatures caring for their children and working on pretty handicrafts in the home, that's how Romans idealized their women as wives and mothers.
Tell us how you really feel about that.
Oh, I might have some strong feelings about this. just maybe. But the cool story is how women got around this. A lot of these women learned spinning and weaving and caring for children, sure. But Romans also, as their empire expanded, had a limit of skilled workers. So a lot of these employers started hiring women as weavers under the table, because even if the law said one thing, they needed skilled workers, and they were willing to pay for it. So they were able to skirt the law that way.
And we have a modern equivalent. If people can't get skilled workers, or even workers who will do the work, who do they hire? There's a lot of illegal immigrants here who do work because other people won't. Mm-hmm.
There is a trend throughout history that it doesn't matter what the law says. People need work done, and they will find ways to make it happen regardless of what the laws are. When Claudius became emperor in around 100 AD, he started loosening some of these restrictions in strategic ways. He created a law that said that women could be freed if they had had 4 children. They wouldn't need to have a legal guardian anymore. So if you produced enough children for the empire, then you didn't need a guardian. Well done, mama. Woohoo. But if a woman hadn't earned her independence, we still have evidence that they found ways around that.
Now, I might point out, the one reason why they wanted them to have children was not just so they'd have workers for the empire or soldiers for the empire, but children were also the Roman equivalent of the social security system.
Mm-hmm,
They're the ones who were going to take care of you when you got old.
It produced stability, so they figured that if a woman had a certain number of children, she was less likely to be financially dependent and left in poverty.
In fact, 100 years ago, there was a slogan that was used to give women the vote that said, if the hand that rocks the cradle will never rock the boat.
Right. Some of the examples we have of women who became very actively involved in business include Umbracia Fortunata. We know about her because she was employed by a guy who produced fish sauce in Pompeii. This is the cool thing about Pompeii. Because Pompeii was preserved almost perfectly when a volcano went off. So we
Vesuvius.
When Vesuvius erupted. We have extremely detailed information because the entire town was preserved perfectly. People standing there cooking, people sleeping. They even have people who were in the middle of having sex who are perfectly preserved in Pompeii. We know exactly what was happening, and that includes documents and records. What they found were these vessels that this man, Umbracius Scarus, used to transport his fish sauce. And on the outside of these vessels, they would write the name of the freedmen who managed his workshops all across the city. Well, one of the names and roles recorded on there is the name of this freedwoman, Umbracia Fortunata. So we know that she was running a workshop as a freedwoman during this time period. We also know of at least 3 women who were moneylenders during this time period. They found these 2 wax tablets near the baths in Palastra in Pompeii. And they discuss a transaction between these 2 women. There's a freedwoman named Pompeia Note and another woman named Decidia Margaris. Pompeia Note borrowed money as a freed woman, and as collateral, she gave Decidia Margaris 2 of her slaves. That was her security deposit. What's really interesting about it is that Decidia had her garden around acting as her agent, but he didn't actually negotiate anything. He was there to sign the form and say that it had happened legally. She's the one who did all the negotiating, and the transaction happened directly between the two women. We know of another money lender. We have at least 3 records about a woman named Fostelia, and she was a professional loan shark. We have records of the collateral that her borrowers left her, earrings, a fancy cloak, other valuables. And we even know the interest rate she charged. She charged about 3% interest, which was considered a pretty big deal in the Roman era.
That was 3% per what?
We don't know that exactly, but we know that it was some kind of 3% interest. And the rates of interest in Roman culture vary from being compounded weekly or daily to being annual. We don't know exactly what those terms were.
The shorter periods of time were a little more common.
Yes. It all depends on exactly what she negotiated, but we know she at least had the power to negotiate and the assets to do it herself. And she held the loan, not a brother, not a husband, not anyone else. Another example is Julia Felix, who was a property magnate. We know she owned an entire block near the amphitheater in Pompeii, which is primo real estate. That's the equivalent of owning the property that the Ritz-Carlton is on, or Central Park West. Okay, that is how amazing this property was. And they even still have the sign that she used to hang outside the buildings she owned, where she listed her properties that were for rental. And they were luxury properties. We're talking fancy baths, shops, taverns, and she advertised that she had apartments on a 5-year lease that were available. This all really culminated around 100 AD when Claudius loosened the restrictions even more. The Roman Empire had a surplus of grain that they wanted to export to the rest of the empire. They wanted it to go out, and they wanted to really conquer these other areas agriculturally. So Claudius introduced incentives to any tradesperson who would do that. And it was tradesperson, not tradesman. He extended the incentives to any woman who owned ships and was willing to export the grain. And this shows not only was he encouraging women in trade, but that women were already a force in the trade. They already had ships, they owned them, and we have one particular example in Pompeii, a woman named Naviolia Tice. We know about her because her tomb is still there. And around her tomb, there are these beautiful reliefs that show pictures of her standing at the stern of a sailing vessel with the full sails up there, and she is the one who is standing there. Even though the tomb is to both her and her husband, it's obvious that she built it with her own money, and it was her who was leading the ship. And this indicates she took advantage of Claudius's incentives for women. When we study the history of women in business, it's important to recognize that even though there are the technical laws and there were the attitudes of the time, there were always subversive ways around that. And the real maxim was get the job done, have the skilled labor that we needed to get that job done. And if a woman had power, if she had resources, if she was smart enough, she could find a way around those restrictive laws.
And of course, the ultimate law is if you make money, it's good.
Exactly. Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about the subject that we discussed today, you can find multimedia content, links to articles we discussed, and videos on our website at www.hiddenhistoryofbusiness.com. You can also find us on Facebook as The Hidden History of Business and on Twitter as well. Thanks for listening.